Hello there, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be joined by Stephen Dinan, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, right after this. You know, as a listener to my podcast, you qualify to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Simply go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. And now here he is, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
DHS removes roadblocks to save time for some refugees who want to come to the U.S. Okay, what are the roadblocks?
Well, the roadblock that they were removing was that if you are a spouse or a child, an under 21 child of a refugee, you are allowed to apply to come to the U.S. as a derivative, basically, because of your family relationship with a refugee or asylee. So somebody who's been granted refugee status or asylum status. And the Trump administration last year announced a rule that those folks had to go through interviews as well. Refugees and asylum seekers, the chief people themselves, always have to go through interviews. But until the Trump administration, it was optional whether you wanted to put the other folks who came on that same grouping, that same package deal, through interviews. The Trump administration said, no, this needs to be mandatory. There's all sorts of fraud here, people lying about whether they were the actual spouse or the under 21 child. There are people sneaking in older children and cousins and that sort of thing, and lying about who they were and false documentation. And the Trump administration said, we need to use this interview tool in order to sniff those people out. So these interviews are now mandatory. The Biden administration has revoked that change and said, nope, it's now back to optional. And we think it basically we weren't getting much payoff for it. What we were getting was longer wait times for the actual people applying themselves. Now, it's worth noting that the backlog was increasing in this particular type of application. The backlog was increasing well before the Trump administration implemented that rule. And it's not clear that that rule actually was causing applications to wait longer. I also couldn't quite find out, based on the data that the Homeland Security was able to provide me, I wasn't able to figure out how many people actually were denied by the interviews. So it's not clear that either statement is true, that the Trump administration was able to weed out more bad actors, that it was causing Homeland Security difficulties. It strikes me this could be one of those instances where the Biden administration looked at something the Trump administration did on immigration and said, yeah, you did it, so we don't like it.
Mm-hmm. No surprise there. All right, illegal immigrant Russians nabbed making run at U.S. border. So it's not only Mexicans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans crossing the U.S. border. We've got Russians as well, huh?
Yeah, and not just sort of jumping the border, being smuggled across the Rio Grande, but trying to literally rush a port of entry. Customs and Border Protection officers reported having two vehicles rushing at the border crossing point at a high rate of speed. And one of the officers actually drew his weapon and fired 4 shots into one of the two vehicles, a Mercedes. The shots didn't actually hit anybody. The other car carrying Russians actually had stopped with the shots, and the Mercedes crashed into the Ford, and a couple of people were injured based on the crash, not the shots being fired. But that's how serious the incident was as they tried to rush the border. It's worth noting that officers reported that at the exact same time all that was going on in one lane at this border crossing, this is with a San Diego border crossing, at the same time that was going on in one lane, another vehicle with Russians was trying to get through, moving with the flow of traffic rather than barreling in, but it was also trying to get through and got stopped. So at one moment, you had 3 different vehicles, unauthorized Russians, basically trying to sneak into the country. It's worth noting, as you said earlier, this is illegal immigration across the southwestern border. For most of my career covering this issue was almost exclusively a Mexican and adult Mexican issue. Last 5 or 6 years, it's become very much a Central American issue. In fact, there are now more folks from the Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala coming across combined than there are Mexicans coming across that border illegally. But the big phenomenon of the last year or so has been folks from outside of those 4 countries. So Russians, but Brazilians, Cubans, Haitians, they've sort of always been there. But you now have in Yuma, we've heard about folks from Uzbekistan You now have this report of Russians. It's more than 160 different countries, nationalities were nabbed at the border in 2021. That's a lot of different people, and it presents a lot of different problems beyond just Spanish-speaking family illegal immigrants, from the key previous sending countries. It's a lot tougher to return these folks. Mexico doesn't take them back as part of the Remain in Mexico policy. So if you're coming from one of those far afield countries and you jump the border, chances are you're going to be caught and released into the U.S., which is of course why that feedback loop. Folks back home see, hey, all you have to do is fly into Mexico, make your way to the border, jump it, and you're going to be caught and likely released, where you get a chance to get a foothold down over the next 3 or 4 years while your case is pending in immigration court. And so I expect to see that number increase. Last I checked, over the last 4 or 5 months of the last year, it was more than a quarter, 28% of those folks who had been caught jumping the southwestern border were not from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And the numbers actually are even worse than that, because single adults from Mexico can be caught and returned and immediately try again. So there's a lot of recidivism in those Mexican and Central American numbers, which doesn't exist for those other countries. So in terms of actual unique crossers, it may be as high as a third of all the people crossing are from those extra-continental countries.
All right, immigrant from Bahamas charged with casting illegal ballots in North Carolina. He's been doing it for 20 years?
Yeah, I've been watching North Carolina for a few years. The federal prosecutors there are really going after this. They brought a series of charges against, I think it was maybe 18 people back in 2018. And then last year in September, right before the 2020 election, they brought charges against another group of, I think, 19 people. And then now here we are, no election really pending, but they brought charges against yet another person. The earlier charges were, by and large, they look like they were here, most of them probably here with some sort of permission, either a temporary visa or legal permanent residence, but not citizens. And they showed up to, get a driver's license generally. And when they said, hey, it's asking if I want to sign up to vote, and what should I do? And some driver DMV clerk says, oh, sure, yes, whatever. And so they sign up, and then some of them actually went ahead and voted anyway. And they're like, oh, we thought we were allowed to. This is a little different situation. This guy from the Bahamas was here living on a passport that he had obtained with a completely bogus birth certificate from Virginia, basically a made up identity from Virginia. His real birth certificate was found in the Bahamas, and ICE agents went ahead and sniffed out the whole story. He wasn't just content with living with the fake passport. He also went ahead and then registered to vote and basically tried to live as a full citizen, not just content with the ID, but actually trying to grab all the other rights of citizenship. And now it's come back to bite him. One thing that's interesting, as I said, I've been keeping an eye on this North Carolina situation for 3 years now. For the last election, after the second group of people had been announced by the prosecutors, I went back and checked the names from the first group, the 2018 group. There were 18 people in that first group of prosecutions. And in 2020, so 2 years later, I found a half dozen of those names were still active in the North Carolina voting rolls. So even though they had been charged and prosecuted and in some cases pled guilty or convicted of illegal voting, North Carolina hadn't actually removed them from their voting rolls ahead of the 2020 election. And that really surprised me. And I wrote a story about it at the time. Well, so for this story, I went back and checked all of the previous people, including the 2020 and the 2018 people, the 6 people that were still left from 2018, and all of the 18 or so people from 2019 or from 2020. And the State Board of Elections has now deactivated or removed all of those voters from the system. After our story, they at least got a little better about cleansing the rolls. They were alerted that they had non-citizens actually voting. That's some good news there.
What are you working on?
We may have talked about this before, but it's going to finally run. The Homeland Security has a new policy. It's called the Protected Area Policy, and it's basically the areas where Secretary Mayorkas says that agents and officers should not enforce immigration laws. So, churches and schools and hospitals have always been considered basically off limits, dating back for more than a decade. But this new policy under Mayorkas adds things like daycares and cemeteries and social services organizations, soup kitchens, drug and alcohol facilities, school bus stop, and oddly enough, anywhere where a rosary might occur. So I went ahead and took DC and plotted, not all of those, because it's impossible to come up with a comprehensive list of all social services organizations, and for that matter, anywhere where a rosary might occur. But I plotted schools and hospitals and daycares and some churches and that sort of basic stuff. And when you look at it, all of DC is basically, except if you're in Rock Creek Park or boating on the Anacostia, you're probably going to be in a no-go zone for ICE enforcement. And that's not unique to Washington. Every major city in the country is likely to have this sort of network of what I call them a city of sanctuaries, where ICE officers are no longer going to be allowed to enforce the law except in really, really, really extreme circumstances. It's called the protected area policy for a reason. They want illegal immigrants to feel comfortable basically operating and obtaining basic services. And so they've told ICE officers, hands off in these locations. And it just really quickly, that rosary issue, the issue here is just how poorly they're written. I'm Catholic, and I have a number of different sets of rosary beads here in my house. It's a very real question whether my house now and the surrounding area is suddenly a sanctuary because a rosary occurs in this location. It's another example of this administration pushing its policies, perhaps not thinking them all the way through. One other quick example, I spoke with an ICE officer who mentioned that in a lot of major cities where ICE has its offices are either in office buildings or next to office buildings that have daycares. Does that mean that ICE officers literally can't enforce the law in their own rooms, in their own offices? That's also, obviously that's not going to happen, but that's how the way the rules are drawn, that's what should happen from that. One officer said, look, this is all about a trap. They're trying to trap officers into an impossible situation, and they've succeeded.
What a fascinating story. Look forward to it. Folks, you can read all of Stephen Dinan's stories at WashingtonTimes.com. As always, Stephen, thank you.
My pleasure, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to WashingtonTimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to WashingtonTimes.com/ANDY. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day.